Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Embrace at the Kids Research Institute's webinar, Misinformation on Social Media, What Parents Need to Know. Embrace is WA's first research collaboration devoted to the mental health of infants, children, and young people aged 0 to 25 years. In today's talk, we are going to hear from researchers at the UWA and the Kids Research Institute Australia about the proliferation of misinformation online, particularly on social media. And we'll discuss how parents and carers can support young people who have constant access to so much information. Before I introduce our wonderful panel, I would like to acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of Australia. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the Noongar Whadjuk, the Yawuru, Karyara, and Kaurna elders, their people, and the lands upon which the Kids Research Institute Australia is located. We thank them for the wisdom they've provided and continue to provide in our efforts to improve the health and development of all children. My name is Geneva Ohan, and I'm co-director of Embrace and the Healing Kids, Healing Family team at the Kids Research Institute Australia. I'm also the director of the clinical psychology programs at the University of Western Australia's School of Psychological Science. I am a clinical psychologist and professor and mom of 3 young people and adolescents. To start off with a bit of housekeeping, I want to reassure those of you who need to jump off this Teams meeting at any point that we'll be recording it and sharing with everyone who's registered. It will be a live Q&A session that follows after our talks. So if you do have a question, I'm going to encourage you to pop it into the chat at any time. We've also had a few questions provided in advance, so thank you to those who have shared questions when you've been registering. Now, it is a great pleasure of mine to introduce our first speaker, who's a colleague of mine at UWA in the School of Psychological Science, Professor Ulrich Ecker. Uli is a world-leading expert in this space, and we are so fortunate to have him here providing his insights and knowledge. His expertise is on the effects of misinformation on reasoning and decision-making. He consults on the design and implementation of interventions and communication strategies to counter misinformation. Uli's work has been cited in reports for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, the World Health Organization and RAND Corporation, as well as governments including Spain, Denmark, and New Zealand. He has provided expert advice to Meta, Facebook, Australian Departments of Health and Home Affairs, and the European Commission. Following hearing from Uli, we'll hear from Rigel Paciente, a PhD candidate and researcher with the Healing Kids, Healing Families team at the Kids. Rai is involved in a broad remit of mental health research at the Kids with a main focus on suicide prevention and medical trauma in adolescents and youth with type 1 diabetes, healthcare accessibility for young people with refugee backgrounds, and LGBTQIA+ people's usage of TikTok. Today, though, Rai will be speaking about their research projects investigating content on TikTok relating to LGBTQIA+ experiences. Next, we'll hear from Ezra Kneebone, a researcher in the Human Development and Community Wellbeing team at the Kids. And like Rai, Ezra wears many hats as well. She has worked on projects focused on the mental health and well-being of fathers whose children have been in neonatal intensive care, and in her work at Monash University on projects related to surrogacy, egg donation, and mitochondrial donation. At the Kids, Ezra oversees the Beacon app, which is a cyber safety app available for parents that was developed in partnership with Dolly's Dream. Ezra will explain supports the app can provide, including its tips on dealing with misinformation in your child's newsfeed. And finally, we'll hear from Adrian Engel, a father of 2 who has been involved in the Kids Research Institute Australia's Parent and Care Advisory Group since 2021. Thanks so much for your role in doing that, Adrian. Adrian, who also does a lot of work with the Fathering Project, will offer his insights as a parent into the importance of digital safety. Now, with everyone introduced, a reminder that we'll have a Q&A following the talks. And if we don't get to all the questions in the time we have today, we'll make sure we can provide a written response afterwards. Now, over to you, Uli.
Thank you. Thank you, Geneva. Thanks, everyone. So I'll have about 15 minutes, I believe, and I'll try and cover a fair amount of ground, so I won't go into too much detail about each aspect. But I just wanted to give sort of a brief overview of the kinds of things that we're sort of thinking about. So I'll start with just trying to define the term misinformation, because that's quite a debated term at the moment. So often there's a very tight focus on things we see on social media, like fake news, claims about events that never happened. But I find that it's much more useful to think of the term in a much more broader sense as an umbrella term that also incorporates sort of claims about causal relationships that are objectively false, like the vaccine autism link that we're, I think, all familiar with. But also importantly, partially true things that are put out there that are actually put out there to support biased and misleading narratives. So, those are sort of half-truths and things that some people would say are just opinion and not really misinformation. But actually, if something is misleading and biased, I would classify it as misinformation. And there's other types like conspiracy theories and so on. But that's just the first thing I want to highlight, that it's a very broad church, the misinformation term, and I think all of them, all the aspects are relevant in this domain. Where it comes from, there's obviously both in the research space, but also in the sort of public debate, there is a huge focus on social media. Now, to some extent that is warranted, but I'll also talk about a few different sources as well. The first thing to note with social media is that a lot of parents, they're just on Facebook or maybe on Instagram. And one important aspect to know is that for a lot of kids, it's much more diverse than that. And there's many, many different avenues that young people can encounter dubious information. They're on multiple platforms. There's blogs. There's lots of stuff that probably I don't even know about. Important to notice that for many people, social media is now the #1 news source. And influencers on social media, there was just a new digital news report that came out yesterday. Influencers are now perceived as the #1 misinformation source by the Australian public. So there's some reason why there's so much focus on social media, but people also receive dubious information through fiction. It's a fascinating documentary of how much the US Department of Defense has influence over content in Hollywood movies and TV series. Initially, I thought it was a conspiracy theory, but it's actually true. They have a lot of influence. So the stuff you see in fiction, the things you read, even the things you hear in music, there's often very misleading and biased and problematic narratives that are, and obviously TV news can also be misleading and so on and so forth. But also there's a lot of interpersonal transmission that is not on social media. For example, during COVID, the initial phases of COVID, there was a study done that found more people actually spread COVID misinformation from person to person than they did online. So that's something we shouldn't necessarily ignore. And in many families, if the parents have dubious beliefs, they do pass them on to the children. We sort of know that. And of course, the new kid on the block, generative AI, no one really knows how that's going to turn out. It can be a significant source of misinformation. It can also be useful. The jury is still out on how useful it can be, but it's something we need to be more and more aware of. But also, the last thing I wanted to mention here is that people are not only misinformed, they're also increasingly uninformed, because news avoidance is at an all-time high. You can kind of understand why the world's in a pretty depressing state at the moment, but a lot of people just try and avoid facts altogether. All right. A big question I'm always asked is, well, what is the impact? And, people can be a bit alarmist about this, but they can also be too blasé about it. So I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Misinformation is just one other type of information. Like all types of information, it can influence our thinking, our judgments, our decisions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every exposure is problematic. Most people, do apply some critical thinking, and most exposures don't actually affect our beliefs or attitudes at all much. It's where it's repeated exposure and where people sort of lack that ability or motivation to think critically about the content, where it's going to have its greatest impact. Impacts on behaviors also exist, and there's documented cases how exposure to COVID-19 misinformation, for example, led to reduced vaccinations and mask wearing, and you see those things, and there's very clever studies that have established causal impacts. But at the group level, we all know that behaviors are influenced by many, many different things. So saying that misinformation always impacts behavior would be, a little bit alarmist. So you need to look at it with some common sense. There are effects. We do need to be concerned about them, but it's not every little thing that you need to be concerned about. Indirect effects are also important. I'm not going to talk much about those. Those are more political effects, influence on public debate, polarization, democratic processes, trust in elections, trust in the media, science, governments. There's a lot of sort of indirect impacts, but I think they're not as relevant today. I spent a lot of time talking about those, but today we'll focus more on the impacts on the individual. Speaking about the individual, not everyone is equally susceptible to misinformation. There's individual vulnerabilities that are important. These can span from general traits, people's fluid intelligence, memory capacity matter, the way they or have the ability to think flexibly about things, cognitive flexibility, need for cognition, which means how much you enjoy actually thinking about things rather than just going on your intuition. Actively open-minded thinking, intellectual humility, which I struggle with, the tendency to admit that you might be wrong sometimes, which is really good. Like if you're, it's really good to be intellectually humble and to always question, do I actually know this? What is the evidence? And am I willing to change my mind if I encounter evidence that maybe doesn't conform to my beliefs? So that's one of the best things that we can try and teach our kids. I was just at a conference and learned a few new things. So one study looked at the impact of autistic traits. I don't think I need to tell most people about this. That doesn't necessarily mean that if you have autistic traits that you have autism, quote unquote. It's something that all people vary on. But if you have a lower ability to engage with imagination or higher attention to detail, you tend to be more susceptible to misinformation and spend more time engaging with it, especially online. We also all know that existing beliefs and attitudes shape the impacts of what we see. So if you encounter something, like if you're already, let's say you're already, keenly aware of your body image and you worry about your nutrition and your diet and you think you might be overweight and you want to watch if you have those sort of attitudes, you're going to be much more susceptible and vulnerable to misinformation about nutrition and so on, right? So that's pretty obvious, but it's very important to establish. And then those things can interact, your beliefs and your traits. For example, another interesting study by the same author, Neo Georgiou from Flinders in Adelaide, found that people who are at risk of an eating disorder were more likely to endorse dietary misinformation, like I just said, but they're also more likely to hold rigid beliefs that are difficult to change. So it's that intersection of both being more susceptible, but also less willing to actually change your mind if you receive information that doesn't really fit your existing attitudes. All right, next thing I wanted to talk about is interventions. So what to do about it. I spent a lot of my research time investigating those. The most obvious things, if someone encounters something that is false, you can just tell them that it's false and explain why it was false and maybe explain why someone may have put that information out there and what the truth is and what the evidence is. The more details you provide, the more likely that's actually going to have an impact. And we do find that on average, it does have an impact, so it's always worth doing. And these corrections also work if someone does have a tendency to want to cling to that belief because it fits with their worldview or their attitudes. Even in those cases, corrections can be very useful. So don't feel like, it's a lost cause and don't counter misinformation when you see it. It can be especially influential actually if it comes from peers rather than from an expert that might not be trusted. Then there's a bunch of preemptive things that we can try and do to help our young people be better prepared. In a general sense, these might be information and media literacy things, teaching kids to evaluate the credibility of sources, teaching them things like lateral reading, like if you encounter something, don't try and think too hard about it, but if you're skeptical, leave the source, leave the website that you're on, go somewhere else, try and corroborate what you're seeing. Those are really important skills. Getting them to understand the environment, that there are political biases and how things are reported. There's lots of monetization, the whole business model of social media, how this all works. Young people need to be taught, right? They won't just know. I'll have it on one of the other slides, but don't just assume kids these days are digital natives. They just automatically know all these things. They don't, right? You need to engage with them and teach them. There's then more specific preemptive interventions, which often go under the label of inoculation. That's where you sort of explain to people what kind of misleading argumentation techniques might be used to persuade them of something that's not true, what kind of logical fallacies that might involve. For example, if you can teach someone what it looks like if someone cherry picks data, then if they understand that concept, they're much more resilient to cherry-picked arguments down the track, even if it's on a totally different topic. These can be gamified. So there's a very famous game called the Bad News Game, where you're the evil fake news editor, and you learn all the strategies that you can use to increase your follower count and polarize your audience. And that's, a fun way to engage kids. We put a game out on climate change disinformation called the Cranky Uncle game, where you learn to be a cranky uncle that denies climate change, and you learn about all the logical fallacies. And it's fun, people can have a competition with their mates or whatever. So that's something we always need to keep in mind, that these interventions need to be engaging and they need to be attractive. And another thing you should do is, if you have the factual narratives, to promote that factual narrative and make that as interesting as you can as well. There's other things you can do. Again, I just learned about this at the conference that I just went to. So one trait that makes people susceptible to misinformation is a tendency to jump to conclusions very quickly on very limited evidence. And this particular study found that if you train this, if you give people, what they did is they gave people lots of ambiguous images, and they trained them to not come to conclusions too early, but to wait until they saw more of the image. So they were trained to wait, think, and only then but then arrive at a conclusion that is actually based on evidence. And this was done both in, if I remember correctly, in healthy adults, but also in people with psychoses. And in both groups, it led to a strengthening of people's analytical thinking and their ability to spot misinformation. But you also need to be realistic that sometimes the best, the psychoeducation approach to teach skills and so on might not always be the best approach. Sometimes if you have a young person, for example, who spends a lot of time on social media and, for example, sees a lot of bad nutrition advice or dubious body image stuff, then it can be perhaps the best avenue to try and motivate them to actually avoid consumption of this stuff, right? How to teaching them how to train their algorithm, setting time limits, or even avoiding specific people because they don't do you any good, right? Those things can sometimes be quite complementary. Important to realize, though, if you want to intervene, if you have young people that you're worried about, that intervention needs knowledge. You need to know what information and content the relevant person or group is actually consuming, is exposed to, is seeking out. You need to know if you want to correct something, you need to learn about that topic area, so you can actually do that with some expertise and say, I've read about this is actually misleading, the truth is this. And you need to understand what those logical fallacies and misleading persuasive techniques are if you want to counter them. So that needs time and needs resources. You need to put some effort in to do that properly. And like I said earlier, don't just assume digital natives have all the knowledge and skills they need. That's just not true. So parents and carers, if they're worried about their children, they need to engage with their children. So they understand their motivation, understand the environment, understand why they're on social media, why they're consuming certain things, share relevant high quality information with your children. So there's something that's competing with the nonsense that they're seeing online. And dinner table chats, the most important avenue to just keep that conversation going so you have some idea of where they're at. But like I said, you need to also educate yourself on the topic. You need to educate yourself about the relevant arguments, narratives, modes of persuasion, what's going on, if you want to have a chance at countering them, and be prepared to set appropriate boundaries in terms of screen time, younger kids, maybe even filters and things like that. And behind all that, remember, trust is the foundation of all influence and persuasion and communication. If your kids don't trust you, they're not going to tell you what they're up to online, right? So it's really, really important to try and put a lot of effort into maintaining that trust. And the final thing I'll say is that I had a chat to my kids, and this was something that they brought up. Young people need confidence, self-confidence, to avoid and resist that influence. So the most important things you can do is from a young age, foster their confidence so they know who they are and they can actually stand up and say, okay, I look like this or I'm like that, but that's fine. I'm fine with that. I don't need to follow that ideal that I'm seeing online or this, the fake ideal and so on. Obviously, it's hard to do. That's not my area of research. There are other people in this room who would have a lot more to say on how to actually achieve that. But I do find it's really important. Final thoughts. If it's something that's really concerning you, and I mean, Adrian is probably a good example of that, go and advocate for system change, lobby for change, go out there in the world, talk to people and try and change their minds. Australians do want more action from platforms and from regulators. And important, don't be confused by the narratives that are largely coming from the US with these fabricated concerns about free speech and the existence of truth. They go, oh yeah, but who's going to decide what is true and false? Well, we have history, we have science, we have journalism, we have lots of institutions whose job it is to determine what is true. Of course, some things are just opinion and you can't always decide what is true and false. Some things it's difficult, but we do know stuff. We do know the Holocaust happened. We do know things that are objective, where there are objective truths. We cannot lose those. They're the very foundation of public debate and all the conversations that we're having. That's something I'm really passionate about, as you might have just been able to tell, but I'll leave it there. Thank you. I hope that was roughly 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Uli. That was so insightful. And we'll now pass it over to Rai for insights on TikTok.
That's all good. Thanks for starting us off, Ulrich. And I think there were a couple of things that definitely stood out as a very interesting to me. One is sort of the mention of generative AI. And, as an avid, full disclosure, as an avid user of social media myself, the blending of social media and generative AI, sometimes we log on to Facebook or Instagram and the first thing that we see is, what was the name? Like Meta something rather, where it sometimes even like forces you to use the generative AI, and sometimes the information there is not entirely correct. And the other thing was, I guess, with the social media ban that's upcoming, I'm wondering whether or not, the usage of social media can be a form of intervention where young people and their parents sit through their social media and what they're consuming, and that can be an opportunity for them to, I guess, talk about, logical fallacies and things like that. So I guess I'm here to talk a little bit about the research that I've done on TikTok, and Ulrich mentioned earlier the sort of like the algorithm that social media uses, and I think TikTok is a prime example of this, especially during the COVID, the acute phase of COVID, where there was a massive uptick of TikTok usage. And one of the things that the TikTok's algorithm does really well is enveloping a user in sort of like these individual landscapes that greatly reflect, I guess, their identity to some degree or their interests. So, for example, for me, I am well enveloped in book talk at the minute. I read quite a bit. And sort of that's literally just my For You page right now. And that's the way that the algorithm manifests on TikTok is a For You page. You open the TikTok app and the first thing that you will encounter is your For You page. And as you scroll, it's everything that you enjoy. And it's very easy to engage with all of that as well because the like button is right there, the share button is right there. You can open up the comments and see what other people think and how people engage with I guess, conversation as well. And so with that, content is very easily spread. We talk about the user side of things, but there's also, I guess, the content creator side of things where the more that people engage with their content, the more that it is spread out. And that's just how the algorithm works. So it's very easy on TikTok to be exposed to any sort of information, regardless of the quality of the information, who it's coming from, and the credibility of that person who's posting that content. And there's a potential for this to be a public health issue considering the demographic of users, as I've noted in these slides there. There's 1 to 2 billion monthly users as of 2024. Well, I put asterisks there because there wasn't, there was quite a range of numbers that I saw in trying to find stats. But yeah, so the most popular users are 18 to 24, so just young adulthood, making up 30.2% of the user base, and the third most popular age group is that 13 to 17-year-old, where age group, 21% of the user base, where they're starting to learn about media literacy and all the things that Ulrich talked about with regards to, I guess, learning more about how to navigate the online space and information in general. So with that in mind, I think that leads us to where the research started in the first and this body of research on TikTok really started with Dr. Karen Lombardi, Dr. Alex Willard, and Jolie Manzufis, who won the Research Focus Area Collaboration Award in 2022, broadly titled TikTok and Child Health, but my specific interest was in the mental health stream. So we've published a couple of papers here. There's Diet Talk, which was led by Emily Monroe, Trauma Talk, which was led by Alex Willard, and ADHD Talk, which was led by Dr. Gail Alvarez. And everything that Ulrich spoke about when it came to diet and I guess like influencers was greatly reflected in those three papers there. And we saw a lot of, I guess, people claiming credibility where maybe it's not the most sound advice that was being put out there. Admittedly, we didn't actually go through the content and examined the accuracy of every single video, but we can pretty much use the credibility of the users as sort of like a proxy as to how accurate the information was. My specific area of interest was on how LGBT people and trans people specifically used TikTok. And it's somewhat different from the findings of particularly Diet Talk and Trauma Talk, in that lived experience was very much centered. So a question in my mind then, at what point does lived experience count as misinformation if they were recounting versus, I guess, if truths vary between individual posters, then I guess what do we count as the truth, or what is misinformation in this instance? But before I go any further, I'd just like to summarize, I guess, the core findings of those two papers to provide a little bit of context on what misinformation could have been present in the data. So there were three core themes that we found across two papers. One is the most important one, I think, which is connection with community. So it's unsurprising that social media is being used as a way to connect with other people, especially considering the global political climate. And I'm looking specifically at the USA and the UK, especially with the regression of trans rights and trans healthcare. And again, the ongoing debate about LGBT rights as a whole. So obviously some young people might feel a little bit, physically or geographically isolated and unsafe even, such that social media becomes a very attractive place to connect with other people and seek advice and share information with each other, particularly when it comes to mental health or physical health care. The second is engaging in discourses. Now, this is where we could have a bit of a chat about mis and disinformation, because the posters are actually very good at combating mis and disinformation about their own sexualities and gender identities, especially against homophobic or transphobic posters. And for anyone who uses TikTok, there's the stitch and the duet functions, which allows you to directly respond in real time to those types of content. So it was very great to see that young people were sort of taking arms and almost in a way advocating for themselves online. But again, whether or not the quality of information was adequate is a completely different question there. And the last thing, the last common theme that we found was recounting effects of social adversity on their mental health. Now, this is, I guess, explicit accounts of, experiences of depression, anxiety, and the more extreme outcomes being suicide and self-injury. So, I put the three asterisks up at the first, I guess, row of these findings, where they start to share, advice surrounding mental health care or general health care, because in past research, that was sort of the main topic where the advice starts to get a little bit dicey. And this goes back to what I was talking before about, I guess, at what point does lived experience reflect what is actually common among people, young people in this demographic. So, there is the potential to share misinformation regarding health or general healthcare advice, particularly for trans people, when it came to transitioning, what that actually looked like for them and getting individualized advice. However, that did get me thinking. And so the rest of what I'm going to talk about today is more like questions that I've pondered upon that I don't necessarily have answers for. And the main question is like, could this be a reflection of how inaccessible information actually is? Ulrich earlier was talking about how, parents also need to be equally or even more informed as their young person to be able to have that debate. However, that information requires that it is accessible in the first place. Now, when we think about traditional academic, information dissemination, oftentimes research papers are hidden behind paywalls. Conferences are also exorbitantly expensive. And there isn't, there's not a lot of push happening in the non-traditional SciComm space. So, these are questions that I did have in mind of how can we actually improve accessibility to this information such that we can, arm parents with correct information. Especially when it comes to, for example, trans healthcare. There's a lot going on in that space at the minute, as it's a hot debate in America and the UK specifically. So yeah, again, these are just 3 questions that I've come to ponder upon, and apologies for the sizing of the font there. But yeah, number 1 is research in clinical care accessible enough for certain demographics so that absorbing misinformation can be avoided, right? So for example, mental health care is still accessible and is inaccessible in Australia to some degree. Accessing gender affirming care, again, questionable there, right? So why would young people go to researchers or clinicians when social media is so attractive right there? The second is, if not, what can we do to do as knowledge generators and holders to be present in combating misinformation? This poses, there's quite a bit of debate, for example, on researchers and clinicians on TikTok. Now, I personally follow a lot of medical professionals on TikTok, which is, just I love, engaging with that type of content, I suppose. But yeah, like, can we be more present on TikTok, for example? Can we be more present on social media? And I think we've started with that effort, with Embracing the Mind, for example. Dr. Alex Willard started that a couple of years ago. And the last question that have been pondering upon is, do we have a responsibility to be at the forefront of the fight? And again, this goes back to, thinking about non-traditional ways that we can communicate our science. If, for example, misinformation was a metaphorical bushfire, are we essentially just letting that fire spread if we are not active in social media spaces? So yeah, just a few things that I've come to ponder, before I go to bed or when I wake up and I open my TikTok, and I'm like, yeah, someone needs to do something about that. And, again, I'm an avid user of TikTok, so there is, I do follow quite a few researchers that are out there debunking myths, but again, their engagement is not as popular. So again, why is that content not as popular? Is it about humor? Is it about personality? Like, what else could it be? So, I think there are some things that we could do as academics and as clinicians to be a little bit more proactive with combating misinformation rather than relying on parents and their young people to take on the burden. Yeah. So I think that's it for me.
Thanks, Rai. Looking at TikTok as a public health issue that in particular disproportionately affects young people today and how they're developing and how they're going is a really unique way to look at this issue. And in particular, given that we've got a video-based format where we have people presenting themselves very persuasively in these short little segments that don't take much information or much attention span to absorb quick bits of information, really makes one think about the potential for misinformation to be spread very quickly on this platform in particular compared to other platforms. Now I'll hand over to Ezra, who's going to walk us through the Beacon app and the support that it has to provide and the tips that the Beacon app can provide to parents.
Scott for the Beacon app. And Beaky's life mission is to really shine a light on the online world. Now, I am holding a plush toy, but this is definitely an app for parents, don't worry. So Beacon really aims to provide parents and caregivers with the knowledge that they need to confidently navigate their children's digital behaviour and reduce the harms that we know that are associated with being online. Now, importantly, Beacon, it encourages parents to be alert but not alarmed. So whilst the app does aim to bring awareness to some of the challenges that children face online, it's also balanced with opportunities that can provide positive social and emotional well-being in kids. Now, the anti-bullying charity Dolly's Dream has partnered with us here at The Kids to help us deliver the Beacon app into the hands of parents. So Beacon provides parents with content that is tailored to them based on their children's ages, the devices that they have at home, and also their own personal topics of interest. So parents can browse the over 700 articles that we've got on the Beacon app, all of which are backed by research. Now, some of the articles we've actually written here ourselves at The Kids, but a lot of the content is actually curated from trusted evidence-based organisations like the E-Safety Commissioner. So the app is really designed to be parents' one-stop shop for everything relating to their kids being online. Now, parents also have the option to complete an interactive and personalised digital family agreement with their kids, which helps them to set boundaries, rules, and consequences for their children's online behaviour. There are also instructions on how to report serious incidences online, like unwanted contact, cyberbullying, or image-based abuse. Lastly, Beacon also sends out phone notifications to users on trending online issues and also the latest research so that parents are kept up to date with what's happening online. Now, Beacon delivers information and practical advice to parents across quite a range of topic areas. And these different topics are informed by evidence and they're defined in something called our digital citizenship framework, which is a long way of essentially saying it's just a blueprint for the app, right? And I just wanted to include this so that the parents online can see the whole range of topic areas that we cover. And a lot of the really popular content that we've got at the moment is around articles that discuss the different games and online sites that kids are using, for example, Roblox. But Beacon does have a lot of information around misinformation on social media, and this kind of falls into two of our categories. The first is learning and education, which covers news and media literacy, which, as Uli mentioned, is our ability to critically think about the information that we receive. And then we also have a category all around online safety, and this covers things from marketing, advertising, and then also certain inappropriate content for kids, like the use of deep fakes in certain situations. So Beacon has content relating to various types of misinformation that you might see on social media, for example, biased news, fake social media accounts, and also fake images. Now, some of the app's content might be more, I guess, explanatory in nature. So it might be explaining what a certain thing is to you, how you might be able to spot it online, and also how you can spot it in your kids' actions if they might be engaging with it. Other articles might provide more, I guess, practical advice. So for example, questions that you can use to initiate a conversation with your child or strategies that your child can then implement when they're online themselves. Lastly, a lot of the content is also specific to certain age groups. So we might have some that's directed at preschoolers versus others that are directed towards teenagers. Now, I just wanted to now share some tips with you all about how teenagers specifically can spot fake news online. Now, these tips are taken from the E-Safety Commissioner and they are featured in the Beacon app. So fake news is often published by maybe independent organisations or reporters, meaning people that might not have done all the appropriate research. So it's important for your teenager to check the story's source and credibility. It's also important to check for any biases or an agenda. So if the story was shared onto your teen's timeline, for example, by a specific account, ask your teen to try and get them to figure out, well, what are the account's actual intentions by sharing that specific news story. Now, generally speaking, people who create fake news are kind of maybe less interested in reporting the truth as they are in producing content that furthers their own interests. So, get your teen to consider, well, how is the story actually written? You know, does it maybe use sensational headings rather than focusing on facts? That can be a really clear indicator of fake news. Lastly, if your teen does feel comfortable and they do want to engage, encourage them to do a bit of a deeper dive into the content. So if they check the article for disinformation, like the deliberate use of outdated, disproven, or irrelevant quotes or facts, that can kind of help them figure out, well, how much should I actually be trusting this source? Now, if you are interested in kind of reading more about fake news, especially for like teenagers and young people, you can go onto the eSafety website. They have a kind of whole web page around resources for young people, or you can just go to the Beacon app. And here's something I prepared earlier, a QR code. If you are interested in downloading the Beacon app, it is free. You can scan the QR code and it will direct you to a website, and you can select if you want to download it from the Apple Store or the Google Play Store. So that's a very quick introduction to Beacon. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ezra, and to Beaky as well for being here to tell us about Beacon and how to use it and what the app is about. And it's also really great to know that we're about to partner with the eSafety Commissioner and Dolly's Dream in order to provide more easy-to-use support for parents around this subject. And now I'm going to pass it over to Adrian, who's going to tell us about parents' perspective and how our children are using social media. Over to you, Adrian.
First of all, thank you for having me here. When I was thinking about this opportunity, I couldn't believe that 4 years has gone by when my daughter and I actually started or attended our very first parent and child advisory group in this building. So it's been a really good journey, and I think I sit here today and I look back at that opportunity. And I reflect and say that it really, really did assist us as a family in terms of the conversations to have, which conversations to have, when to have them. And I would encourage everyone as a parent to get your kids involved in those levels of conversations as early and as soon as possible. So being the father of two young girls, 12 and 6, this topic really resonates with me because I feel that when I look at what is available in terms of the misinformation and how it's targeted, I always look at how much information or misinformation is targeted at young ladies, especially in our society today. And obviously that's a conversation for another day. And so it is a conversation that my wife and I have, and we speak openly about it at home. I've been an advocate for the Beacon app for the last 4 years. I've been able to be part of certain trials when the Beacon app was, implementing new systems and new support functions. And so I want to also just share that journey with you. But I almost want to, if you will allow me, to start at the end and then go to the beginning. So my daughter, as I mentioned now, has just turned 12. We've been using the Beacon app for the last 4 years. And I want to share 2 realizations around misinformation and how quickly it can filter into the home. And so at the age of 12, we've decided that it was an opportunity to give her a little bit more responsibility in our home. So as she moves into or transitions into a young lady, we've given her her own bathroom. So with that comes the responsibility of maintenance and cleaning that bathroom. And as I said, she's just entered high school and she now has her own mobile device. But it's so important to realize that influencers all have life hacks now. So they teach us how to bypass certain things or a quicker way of doing something. So to all the parents out there, be careful of what the kids watch, because I have now for the last 2 months, tried to remove wax off the tap of our guest bathroom, because somehow, somewhere she saw that if you apply wax to a tap, you'll never have to worry about water stains again. And so be aware of what they are watching. And as I said, everyone now has a life hack, which makes your life easier and simpler. Another realization I think really hit home for us. So she's very active in sport, and she's found her craft, and we've been very fortunate enough that she's seen some level of success in a very short period of time. She was invited to a sporting event where she had the opportunity to meet a social media influencer who she and I both enjoy following, watching. The gentleman's very entertaining. And so you look at his life online and you go, this is it. This is really good. And he has all these opportunities, all these sponsors. And then we had the opportunity to spend some time with him. And as the evening progressed, I think it came back to the old, it's sometimes better not to meet your heroes in person. And so it was a very, very quiet drive home. And I think those were the two realizations for her recently, that everything that we are exposed to online is actually not what it seems to be. And so that's been very useful. But I want to go back to when she was 8, and we had the opportunity to be exposed to the Beacon app, and the difference that the family agreement or contract made for us as she was entering that stage of where she was being exposed to devices. So as we know, our current education curriculum requires students to start using an iPad. And then also at a later stage, they encourage you to start forming WhatsApp groups within the school. So it was something that we were quite aware of, and I think as every parent were not prepared for. So that intervention of being part of that advisory group and being part of some of the trials with the Beacon app came at such a vital time for us, because whenever I have the opportunity to talk to other parents, I go, those fundamental rules that were put in place has now assisted us in where we are today with our kids, and especially with my 12-year-old. And it was simple things like where to use your device, where to charge your device. You spoke about conversations at the dinner table, so no devices allowed at the dinner table. I said no devices in the bedroom. And even something as simple as a device-free evening. So Friday nights are movie nights, family movie nights. Again, the movies that the kids sometimes select is also a conversation for another day, when you have to sit there for 2.5 hours and endure what we're watching. But again, being part of that and being present. And I think, again, when I reflect on my journey and how those little interventions have assisted us, I think as parents, we've also got to realize that it's not going to be easy. I say there's a level of discipline that comes with implementing something like that, but there's a level of discipline that comes with sticking to it. And as I said, I sit here now 4 years down the track, and that's why I felt it was important to start at the end and then go to the beginning, because if you are disciplined and you believe in what's out there and the dangers that are out there and are aware of it, I think the conversation then becomes so much easier. And I think my final thought, or something that I want to leave you with again, is I think be aware as parents the role model that you play and the influence you have on your child. We sincerely cannot sit and tell our kids to get off a device if we are sitting on a device. And I want to just end on that. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights, Adrian, as a parent. And it makes me really think, after the boys have been cleaning their bathroom, I better go home and really check that tap this evening. And it's also really good for us to know as researchers what's going on for parents and their experiences of social media and what their kids are developing in this new world that children are developing in, that hasn't existed before this. It is a unique time right now that as researchers we need to be acknowledging and looking newly at research and how do we understand development in this context. So thank you for that. Yeah. What I'd like to do now is to open up to questions. I know some people have been putting them in the chat. Please keep on going. Please do that. I'm going to start with one that we had come through beforehand as people were registering, and then I'll go to the chat. I was wondering, what are the panel's thoughts on the social media ban that will take effect in December 2025? And specifically, two questions about that. Do you think it will be effective? And are you going to be studying its impact? Did you want to start, Lily?
Yeah, it's difficult to give a very, clear-cut answer to that, because I do see some of the rationale behind it and the justifications for it. But I also believe that it's sort of a bit of a knee-jerk reaction that is maybe not really thought through, because with all our interventions, we always need to consider what's the unwanted side effects. There's a lot of good stuff that does also come from social media for children and young people. And young people develop into adults, and we want them to function in our society as well, properly. And if you don't practice things, you're not going to get any better at them. You might get more anxiety about them. We know that from, decades of research and experience. So I'm not sure a ban is really the right pathway. I think there should be instead a much greater investment into education. That's the key. Other countries around the world, I mean, Finland is always, not everything's great in Finland. I've met Finnish people. It can't be all great. But, they have revamped their school curriculum to an extent where they teach information literacy across all subjects. They teach about how to mislead people with statistics in math. They talk about propaganda in their Finnish classes. They talk about misleading imagery in their arts classes. They use every single stream in a very systematic fashion to teach these skills, right? That's what we need. We need, people who come through the education system having developed the knowledge and the skills that they need to, thrive in this sort of new world. Just a ban is a lazy political substitute for actual engagement. Even though I can see some of the benefits, I would lean towards not really supporting it, at least not in the way it's sort of currently proposed to be implemented.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree, especially with regards to increasing media literacy in schools. And also just on the point of unwanted effects, again, while there is a lot of misinformation online, like what, particularly for vulnerable groups, if you take away social media as a form of connection, particularly for those that are isolated, what are the consequences of that? And again, in the context of LGBT, particularly young people who are trying to figure out who they are, and how to access different things in a world that is very inaccessible. What does that mean for them? But also, I think I tend to be an advocate about, surrounding harm reduction is not really the right thing here. But in school, for example, if somewhat of a different case, but alcohol, we got talks on alcohol and how to navigate that safely, because there is some understanding that while teenagers are not supposed to drink alcohol, some will. And I think I wonder if that's going to be the same thing with social media, where there is supposed to be a social media ban, but depending on the parents' capacity to monitor that, are there ways to go around that such that people will consume social media anyway? So yeah, I think media literacy is definitely literacy, information literacy in general is might be the way to go? Question mark? Yeah.
Nothing you'd add. I agree with both of you. Yeah.
Yeah, same. I think again, just from a parenting point of view, from what I've read, it's been implemented in other countries and have failed. And I'm more interested in finding out how we will, as a country, overcome those failures to make sure that something like that is sustainable. Yeah.
Or thought. Governments also have other levers, right? So there could, of course, be more regulation and more friction, and the screws could be tightened a little bit on the platforms and what they're able and allowed to do. That's a very complex, complicated space. But like I said, people generally actually are more concerned about the misinformation out there than they are about free speech. And they do largely support, even in the US, more regulation in this space. Again, very tricky, thorny issue, but that's what we our politicians to sort through those issues and talk to experts about how it could best be done. So I think it's education and regulation.
And that's come through online that perhaps we'll start with Rai and Adrian about. I think it would be great for researchers to work at ways of debunking myths on TikTok. Do you have any ideas for how researchers might grow a following that young people would want to watch? Yeah.
So I do.
You're more experienced in TikTok than I am.
Yeah, I guess this brings us back to the question of why influencers are very popular on social media. And this is one of the findings of the Diet Talk paper, actually, is that personality is everything. And humor actually dictated how much engagement a video received. And so I think, when it comes to researchers perhaps intervening by being on TikTok and being on social media, I guess like that's just another skill for us to learn in the same way that we have to learn how to present to other academics, to in conferences or even this, right? But yeah, I guess a presence is a good place to start, followed by how do we make ourselves and our research a little bit more interesting, rather than, if we're going to talk about knowledge translation, being able to translate our research in a way that a layperson would understand. Like, for example, next week I'm going to help run the 3-minute thesis event, and one of the big components of that is like, how can you make the average Joe understand what you are doing? Spouting statistics might not be the best way to go about it. Like, what does that actually mean in the context of people's lives, right? So yeah, presence to begin with, and then I guess evolving that skill, I guess institutionally, and also as a what's the word that I'm looking for, as an industry, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think, again, we spoke about it in the first question around the levels of education that are out there and the levels that of awareness are out there. And again, I reflect on what transpired with when my daughter met one of her heroes on social media. And we see that as his life. And that's how exciting, that sporting career can be, until we met the individual in real life and actually realized that it was a complete different situation. So I think that sort of education is important, and it's more about the continuous education. It's not something that we can do once off and then think everybody will grasp it. Yeah.
So much. I know we're getting a little bit late for time, so maybe just 2 more questions. One is, when is the right age? Oh,
I think over there.
yep.
Sorry, all right. Thanks for letting me ask my question. My name is
Sorry, yep.
Yeah, sorry. My name is Julian. I have 3 sons. One's just turned 18, so I have an adult child at home, which is remarkable. 15 and 12. And first, I want to say thank you very much to the panel and the chair for this session. I really appreciate the mix of the academic perspective, the tools that young people use, and the investigations and the solutions of which you go about investigating it, book talk, TikTok. And so I really appreciate that. Thank you. As well as the wonderful Beacon app, which I've just downloaded and I've just communicated. I really appreciate that. And also particularly to Adrian, the community and parent member and representative and person that's key to involvement in all of this, the parental perspective. I'm very grateful for your contribution to that as well. I've learned a lot already. My question particularly is, in fact, related to the ban question, if I may, because I did ask that question, so I kind of feel a bit that I'm asking too. But with regards to the ban, what can the community do? Because I heard very strongly from you all that education is important and bans don't really work. And I personally, as a parent, agree with that perspective as well. But what is the recommendation from the panel on what the community can do in the conversation about the social media ban? Do we write to our local representatives? Do we advocate, or do we? I mean, how do we go about this? And I had imagined perhaps will it be data first to monitor the effectiveness of the government's ban, and then there is this emerging of conversation in the community to say that education will be better and digital literacy improvements is the way. So I know I've rambled for quite a while, but I think that I wanted to make that point because I think here is an opportunity for the community to be involved in all of your activities. Thank you.
I can make a start. Yeah, write to your local representatives, like everything that, there's so many avenues that could be taken. One other avenue, and when you went through the ages of your children, that reminded me of my own children. They're 20 and 17. The 20-year-old was really a mentor for the younger son. He taught him all about the manosphere and the incels and the health rubbish and the nutrition and the body image issues that boys these days face as well. When everyone wants to bulk up and so engaging the older kids to be our sort of wingmen or wing women, wing people, that would be really, really useful. And I think, pushing this through schools, again, education is important to, explain that it's important to speak up. It's important to intervene when you see something that's wrong and not just be quiet. And there's lots of research showing how effective that can be. So there needs to be a culture around this, right? That's not going to always work. It's not always going to be useful. But like I said, there's many avenues, and that's also one really important one, I believe.
I think you've taken the right step. I think you've taken the first right step by downloading the app. I think when you ask the question around what do we do as a community, I think one of the things that we used to walk away from when we were part of the advisory group, or the advisory group was just starting off, was, and I'm going to challenge you on this now, is to share that app. Because I think, again, when we talk about education and where it starts, I've always, as an immigrant to this country, I've always believed that it starts with you. So it starts in the home. And so my challenge to you in terms of what do we do as a community is, I think the challenge I want to leave with you is share that app and start talking about it at home. And then I do absolutely agree with you, Ulrich. I think, again, in our school system, there's a huge gap in terms of where is that level of intervention, because I almost think the next question is going to be the age question, which is a tricky one. But where is that level of intervention? And again, coming back to my original point, whose responsibility is it? I think there is where that big gap is. Who's accountable for that? Who's responsible for that? So my point again would be, I think, take the accountability and take that responsibility first as the parent, and then let's work on who needs to look after the sustainability of it. Yeah.
And that is a perfect segue to our last one. You're exactly right. It is the age question. It is, when is the right age for mobile phones without internet access, and when's the right time for mobile phones with internet access and social media? And can you put an age on each question and why? And do you want to give that one a go, Adrian?
I think, again, it comes back to, I don't think that you can use a cookie cutter approach. I think, again, it's the situation at home. I think it's also the level of confidence that you have as a parent in terms of education or self-education. I was asked the other day about my daughter's sporting abilities, and I was asked what was the right age, or what was the age that I got her into the sport. And I had to quickly think about the answer. And so instead of saying, oh, she was 4 when she started her sport and that's why she is at the level that she is right now, I think it's relatable in this question as well. It's how comfortable are you? How well educated are you? How well are you set up as a support? And then I think it comes down to also the level of engagement that you've had with the child. And I know I'm beating around the answer, but I think it's important to understand and give context before you almost pin it on an age. Yeah.
There is a really great resource that the eSafety Commissioner has put together. If you go onto their website and you go onto their parents page, I think it's called is my child old enough, or something around age, and they have a whole list of different, and they basically give you questions to consider so that you can kind of come up with an age range for yourself based on you and your family. because of what you just said. So sorry, that is really annoying if you wanted a direct aid, but just check out that resource.
Itching for everything.
My 18-year-old will be very happy to hear that. I think we'll close there, and I want to start by thanking the panel so much for everything that you've had to contribute here today. And thank you to everybody in person here and online who's attended. I want to also reassure everybody who's online, if you've popped a question into the chat or if you gave one to us upon registration, sorry we couldn't get to everything, but we will attempt to answer that by email that we send out to everybody who registered, along with the link for this webinar recording. So thank you for watching.